The war is over. Everyone knows it. The smoke is gone. The ravens carry good news for once. And if the war is over, then the soldiers are coming home, and with them, the healers, the supply runners, the letter carriers, the people who were supposed to come back. So Alara waits. She has been standing at the eastern gate for 2 days. Her mother said, "Stand at the stone with the crown carved on it. Wait. If I don't come, someone will." Her mother had a way of saying things that made them feel like certainty, like weather predictions or mathematical proofs. Alara has never known her to be wrong. The gatekeeper stopped giving her bread on the second morning. The guards have stopped noticing her. She is 7 years old and has been invisible her whole life. This is nothing new. She has 47 marks scratched into the soft dirt behind the crown stone, one for every person who walks past without stopping. She is not counting out of hope. She is counting because counting is something to do with her hands while she waits. Then the horns sound. The crowd draws back in one long exhale. Wolves appear first, iron gray and massive, moving like a river finding its channel. Then soldiers. Then a silence that moves ahead of him like a tide pulling out to sea. And then him. Alara doesn't know what he's done or what he's taken. She knows one thing. He leads the armies, and armies have records, and somewhere in that column is someone who knows where her mother is. She steps directly into his path. "Excuse me," she says, holding up the folded letter. "I can't read this. Can you?" Quick pause, comment where you're watching from, and if you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. I've got a lot more coming. She had a system. Every person who passed the crown stone received a mark and a classification. Boots, good ones, oiled and buckled, meant no. A hurried stride meant no. Anyone who made eye contact first meant definitely no, because people who looked at her already knew they were going to keep walking, and the look was how they managed the guilt of it. 47 marks. Not one exception. The Alpha King made no eye contact at all. He was looking somewhere above the crowd, above the gate, somewhere that had nothing to do with the road in front of him. He moved like a man whose mind was already 3 rooms ahead of his body. His wolf, iron gray, enormous, moving at his flank like a shadow with its own gravity, turned its enormous head when she stepped forward, but the man didn't. Not until she was directly in front of his horse. The horse stopped. It had better manners than most of the people she'd met. "Excuse me," Alara said. She kept her voice the same way her mother had taught her to keep a candle in wind, steady through deliberate effort. "I can't read this. Can you?" She held the letter up. It was wrinkled along the fold lines, soft from handling. She had pressed it flat every morning and folded it back every evening so it would survive. So far it had. The man looked down at her. His face did not change in any way she had a word for, but something moved behind his eyes, a door opening somewhere at the back of a very large house. He dismounted. It took about 4 seconds. When he was standing on the ground, he was even taller than he had been on horseback, which she hadn't thought was possible. He took the letter. He read it. He went very still. Alara watched his face. She was good at reading faces. Her mother said it was because she paid attention to the things other people were too polite to look at. What she read on his face now was not something she had a clean name for yet. It was something like recognition, and something like grief, and something like a man bracing himself against a wall that had already moved. "Your mother sent you here," he said. Not a question. "Yes," she said. "She told me to wait at this stone. I've been waiting 2 days. I'm also hungry, but that can wait. I would like to know first what the letter says." She thought about it. "Please." He read it to her. He did not change his voice or soften it or use the particular tone adults used when they were deciding how much truth a child could hold. He read it the way her mother had written it, directly, without ornament. The words were her mother's voice, exact and specific, and Alara absorbed them the same way she absorbed cold, entirely, without being able to stop it. When he finished, he folded the letter the same way she had been folding it. He held it out. She took it. "My mother said," Alara said, her voice only slightly different than before, "to trust the person who reads the whole thing without stopping." He hadn't stopped. She considered him for one more moment, the scar on his throat, the exhaustion beneath the authority, the fact that his hands were completely steady while hers were not, and then she took his hand. He looked down at their joined hands with an expression she would spend the next several months learning the name for. Later, she would understand it was the face of someone who had expected to feel nothing and found, without warning, that they still could. She had prepared for this. 3 years. Every recorded battle decision, every treaty clause, every field report she could source from the northern archives before the ink dried. She had read Draven the way she read terrain maps, looking for the pattern that would reveal the flaw, the pressure point, the place where the structure was weaker than it appeared. She had found one. She was not entirely certain she'd been right. She stood with the assembled court in the great hall and told herself she would not be surprised. The court around her was nervous in the particular way of people who had profited from a war and were now recalculating. She understood them perfectly. She had no particular sympathy for them, but she understood them. He entered in his wolf form. The iron-gray wolf was larger than she'd expected from the reports. It moved into the hall like weather moving into a room, and the court's nervous energy became something quieter and more fundamental, the kind of stillness that prey learns from birth. She held her ground. She had made a decision years ago that she would not let her body make choices her mind hadn't authorized. Then she saw the child on his back. A small girl, sitting between his shoulder blades with one hand fisted carefully in the thick fur at his neck. Not gripping in fear. Holding on the way a child holds the rail of a ship, because it's the practical thing, and she decided to trust the vessel. The child was looking around the hall with an expression of frank, systematic evaluation. Her gaze moved from face to face like she was taking notes. The court didn't know what to do. Neither did Alara. He shifted at the center of the hall, a smooth transition, no performance, and stood, lifting the child in one motion, settling her against his arm. A courtier near the third column said something under his breath. Something with the words Omega Orphan in it, and a tone that made Alara's jaw tighten. Kale stopped walking. He turned. He looked at the courtier with an expression that contained no emotion whatsoever, which was significantly worse than any expression that did. He said nothing. The courtier pressed himself against the pillar like he was hoping to become an architect. The child surveyed the assembled court, settled her gaze on a point somewhere above them all, and announced, with complete and uncomplicated confidence, "The king is a good man. My mother said so. She is very smart. Was very smart." A brief pause. She knew things. Something moved in Kale's jaw. He turned away from the court, ordered the guest wing prepared, food brought, and a bath drawn. The court erupted into whispered calculation the moment his back was turned. Alara watched his face when he thought no one was looking. It was the face of a man following through on a decision he made a long time ago, not reluctant, not proud. Resolved. The face of someone paying a debt they considered sacred. She had spent 3 years mapping him as a weapon. That face was not in any of her maps. She filed it away. It would matter later. She was already certain of that. She had been mapping the palace since her first morning. Not with paper, paper required asking for paper, and she had not yet determined what the rules were about asking for things. In her head, instead, a mental architecture of allowed spaces and not allowed spaces, doors that opened and doors that didn't, corridors that matched the outside of the building and corridors that didn't. On the third morning, she identified a discrepancy, a stretch of exterior wall along the northeast wing that was 8 feet longer than the interior hallway behind it. She had been investigating it for 3 hours, pressing walls, counting paces, mapping the difference, when she found the Scholar General doing exactly the same thing from the other direction. They regarded each other for a moment. "I noticed it on my second morning," the Scholar General said. "I noticed it on my first," Alara said. She considered the fairness of the situation. "But you found the eastern entrance." "I hadn't gotten there yet. We can share the discovery." The Scholar General looked at her for a moment with an expression Alara couldn't quite classify. Then she pressed the eastern wall panel. The sealed archive room behind it was full of records from a previous reign, ledgers, correspondence, bound volumes of land agreements, all of it layered in dust. They worked through it together without discussing whether they were working together. The Scholar General could read all of it. Alara could organize all of it. It was an efficient arrangement. They were on their way back through the courtyard when Alara stopped. A stable boy, perhaps 12, wiry, with frightened eyes, was being punished for a broken bridle strap. Publicly. In the way designed to make the watching as much a part of the punishment as the strap itself. 3 guards. The boy's hands braced against the stable wall. "That's not right," Alara said. Not loudly. Not as a protest. The way she said true things as observed fact. The Scholar General's hand moved before her expression did. She stepped forward into the center of the courtyard and said, with the voice of someone who had once commanded armies, "Stop." Immediately. The guard stopped. They turned. They looked at the king's political ward and calculated. Lord Idrin appeared from the far archway, hands folded, smiling with perfect warmth. He told the guards to continue. His voice carried the comfortable authority of a man who had spent decades making rooms rearrange themselves around him. Alara moved in front of the boy. She was 7 years old, and she weighed very little. She knew this. It was a strategic disadvantage she was accounting for in real time. She stood in front of him anyway because some calculations had only one answer regardless of the variables. Kale arrived from the upper corridor. He took the scene in one look. The guards, Idrin, the Scholar General's position, Alara's position, the boy behind her, and something in his face settled into a specific kind of quiet. He said something to Idrin. Quiet enough that Alara couldn't hear the words, but she could hear the texture of them. Idrin's smile disappeared. That evening, a new palace order was posted on the board outside the council chamber. The Scholar General read it twice. Alara asked her what it said. She read it aloud. Treatment of all palace staff, effective immediately. Alara nodded. She went back to her map. The Scholar General wrote a letter that night to her contact in the south. Not a report. Just 4 sentences. The last one read, "Something is happening here that I did not predict. I don't know yet what to do with that." She had prepared 12 arguments. The Eastern Archives contained pre-war land agreements that were, by any legal reading of the surrender terms, relevant to her people's rights along the southern border. She had been denied access twice by 2 separate administrators with 2 separate reasons that did not hold up under examination. She had documented both. She had organized her arguments by anticipated objection, bureaucratic resistance, political sensitivity, precedent concerns, and she had mapped 3 different routes to the same conclusion. She presented the first argument. He listened. When she reached the end of the second sentence, he said, "Granted." She stopped. He was looking at her with an expression of mild patience, as if waiting for her to continue. She recalibrated, and she did not do it slowly. She had been recalibrating at speed her entire career. She set down argument 2 and said, "What do you want in return?" Something shifted in his face. No offense, closer to the particular discomfort of a person who has spent years presenting a negotiating posture and has recently stopped wanting to. "Advice," he said. "About the child. I don't know how to answer the questions she asks about her mother. I've been answering them badly." She waited. "She asked me yesterday if her mother was afraid when she died. I told her I didn't know." He paused. "That was true, but it wasn't useful. I don't know how to do the useful part." Alara considered this with the same precision she applied to everything. "She doesn't need answers," she said finally. "She needs to know the questions are allowed, that she won't be managed or redirected when she asks them. She needs the space to hold something that has no resolution yet." The silence that followed was thoughtful rather than empty. "She asked me today," he said, "if I had ever been lonely." "What did you say?" "Yes." She looked at him across the space of the desk. The afternoon light was gray, coming off snow, very even and cold. He looked like a man who had said something true to someone and was uncertain what happened next. "That was the right answer," she said. She stood, gathered her materials, 12 arguments still folded in her satchel, none of them needed, and left. In the corridor outside, she stopped walking. She looked at her hands. They were not entirely steady, which was unusual. She was a woman who had maintained composure under artillery fire, and she could not account for why her hands were doing this now, in a palace corridor, after a conversation that contained nothing alarming. She examined the question the way she examined everything she couldn't immediately explain. She put it in a file. She labeled the file, "Later." She had a sense it would not stay there. She had decided they should eat together. This seemed obvious to her. They were the 3 people who lived in this section of the palace. The Scholar General had the east rooms. The king had the north. Alara had the guest wing, which was 5 times larger than any room she'd previously slept in, which she found both impressive and wasteful, though she had not said so yet because she was calibrating what to say and when. She had presented the proposal to each of them separately as a fact that had already been decided. Neither adult had found a mechanism for telling a 7-year-old with a logistical plan and a reasonable tone that the plan would not be happening. Dinner was almost comfortable. Kale told a story from the campaign, something about a supply wagon that got mired in a creek crossing and the wolf assigned to help pull it out, and what happened to the wagon, and what happened to the wolf's dignity. By the 3rd sentence, the Scholar General was pressing her fingers to her mouth. By the end, all 3 of them were laughing. Real laughter, the kind that arrived without permission. Alara had not heard Kale laugh before. It changed his face entirely, made it younger and less careful. Lord Idrin was also present. He had arranged to be. He watched all of it with the warm, attentive expression of a man at a pleasant dinner. His eyes were not warm. They moved between the child, the Scholar General, the king, with the systematic focus of someone cataloging data points. At the end of the meal, he raised a glass. A toast, warmly worded, precisely constructed. He welcomed the child to the palace. He noted the historic nature of her origin. He referenced, twice in 3 sentences, the political weight of her Omega status and the generosity required to accommodate it. Each word landed where he meant it to land. Kale's hand flattened against the table. The shift came the way it always came for him, without warning, without a period of coming. One moment the man. The next, the wolf, enormous and disoriented and crackling with 3 years of war that had never fully discharged. The Scholar General pulled Alara back. Alara went and then turned and walked forward. She sat down directly in front of the wolf. The wolf was larger than she was by several orders of magnitude. Its breathing was ragged and its eyes were not quite focused on anything in the room. She didn't approach it like something dangerous. She approached it like a chair she'd decided to sit nearby. She put her hand on its muzzle and waited. The wolf went still. Later, much later, the Scholar General with her back against the wall, Kale on the floor, Alara explaining to the wolf in a thoughtful, interested tone that everyone sometimes felt like running away, but the people worth staying for were worth the staying. Alara fell asleep between them, her head against his flank, one hand curled in the Scholar General's sleeve. In the silence after, the Scholar General said, quietly, "That wasn't natural." "No," Kale said. "It wasn't." He was looking at Alara. His face, in the dim torchlight, was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. The Scholar General sent for the palace physician in the morning. The child was asleep. She had fallen asleep in the chair she'd dragged to the corner of Kale's study, the one from the window seat, which she had moved approximately 4 feet closer to where the adults were sitting because she had decided this was a conversation she should be near. He'd intended to send her to bed. He'd looked at her face and found he couldn't. The fire had died to coals. He and the Scholar General sat on opposite ends of it, and he talked. He did not know entirely why. It was possible the fire had something to do with it, the specific, particular privacy of a low fire in a cold room, the way it made everything close and contained. It was possible the Scholar General's silence had something to do with it. She didn't fill space the way most people did. She let things be quiet and waited. "South of the Red Mark Pass," he said. 3 years ago. We'd taken 3 casualties in the gorge, and I went back for the wounded myself. Stupid decision. I wasn't much better than the wounded by the time I reached the field hospital. He paused. She was already there. The Scholar General had gone very still. She didn't ask who I was. She didn't recognize me until the fever broke, I think. And then she knew, and she kept working. He looked at the coals. She talked to me while she worked. Not at me. To me. Like I was a person temporarily in a difficult situation and not whatever else I was. He was quiet for a moment. She told me about her daughter. The ink on her fingers. The habit of asking questions. The Scholar General's design of the Red Mark operation was something she had lived with for 3 years. She knew the field hospital had been in the gorge. She knew the toll of the gorge crossing. She had not known Marin Voss was in the hospital when the operation ran. She asked me, he said, to find her daughter. If she didn't come home. She was afraid not of dying. She was very specific about this, but of her daughter waiting alone. From the direction of the window seat chair, a small voice said, "She's dead, isn't she?" Not a question. Alara had been awake for some time. She had been working through it quietly, in the dark, assembling the evidence. The past tense his voice used. The way the Scholar General had looked at her since the beginning, with something that wasn't quite pity. The letter, which she had memorized, and which said something near the end that she had been turning over and over for a week. Her face moved through things she did not have words for. It moved quickly, the way a current moves, visible at the surface, vast underneath. Then she said, with the precision she brought to everything that mattered, she told me good people are hard to find. She said when you find one, you hold on. She looked at Kale. She looked at the Scholar General. She nodded once, as if confirming something to herself, and then walked to the corner and sat down and cried quietly, with her face turned to the wall, because she had been taught by the camps, by the road, by 7 years of being easy to overlook. That grief was something you processed privately so as not to be a burden. Kale started to rise. The Scholar General caught his arm. Give her a moment. A pause. Then go. He crossed the room. He sat down on the floor beside her. He did not speak. He did not try to fix it. He was simply there, which was the only thing that mattered. After a while, she leaned against him. The Scholar General sat alone by the dead fire with 3 years of strategic preparation in ruins and something in her chest she could not quantify or file away or make any tactical sense of. She sat with it. That was all she knew how to do. 3 days after the revelation, she had reorganized her grief. Not because she had finished with it, she understood, in the particular way that children who have been through difficult things understand, that grief was not something you finished with, but something that lived in you and changed shape. She had reorganized it the way she reorganized everything, into a set of questions with actionable answers and one question without one. The one without an answer was where her mother was buried and whether she could bring something to put there. She was working on the how. Lord Edrin found her in the library on the 4th morning. He was kind. Smoothly, impeccably kind, the specific warmth of an adult who has decided a child is an opportunity. He sat across from her and smiled and asked about her progress in the palace, and she answered his questions, and he answered hers, and his answers were thorough and well delivered. She filed each one. Then he said, I've been concerned about what you overheard the other night. About what the king plans for you. She waited. Your mother, he said, very gently, may not be dead. She was 7. She was also her mother's daughter, raised in healers' camps by a woman who had taught her, before anything else, how to think. She asked 3 questions. Quietly, directly, without inflection, when was this information confirmed? Who confirmed it? How did it reach you? The questions were specific. They were the kind of questions designed to find the load-bearing beam in a structure, the place where it would hold or fail. He answered all 3. Smoothly. She filed the answers. She went with him because her mother might be alive. This was the only truth that could have made her go, and he had known it. She walked beside him through the lower corridors, through the outer gate, onto the road that narrowed into the tree lane, and she catalogued everything: his pace, his direction, the way his warmth faded degree by degree the further they went from the palace walls. The trees closed in. His hand moved toward her arm. Elara stopped walking. You answered the 3rd question wrong, she said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced steadiness. I asked how the information reached you. You said through a contact who knew my mother. But my mother never shared information through intermediaries she hadn't personally vetted. She told me this. She said it was how healers stayed safe in war camps. She looked at him. She would never have sent a message through someone she didn't know. He reached for her. She ran. She ran in exactly the right direction. She had been mapping this road since the beginning, and she ran without hesitation because her mother had taught her that indecision was the most dangerous thing. She screamed Kale's name once. Not repeatedly. Once as loud and clear and specific as a signal fire. His name, in her voice, with everything she had. And she kept running. The iron-gray wolf hit the tree line from the north at a speed that made the trees move. The arrow was meant for her. It found the wolf instead. He was unconscious for 2 days. During those 2 days, the Scholar General ran the council. She did it with the precision of a woman who had been thinking 3 moves ahead since the first morning she arrived in this palace, and who had, without deciding to, already mapped what needed to be done and in which order. She issued 4 emergency orders. She unsealed the archive Idrin had locked 4 years ago, the one the child had found, the one that turned out to contain rather more than land records. She identified the architecture of his operation in its entirety, and she did it with the cold, exact focus of a woman who had been handed a complex problem and found that solving it was the only thing preventing her from being somewhere she couldn't be at. She also went to his chambers every morning. She told herself she was checking on Alara. This was true. Alara had not left the chair beside his bed since they carried him back from the forest, except to eat and wash, and she returned to the chair immediately after both. The girl needed, the Scholar General thought she needed oversight. Company. Someone to verify that adults who were worth staying for tended to survive. On the morning of the 2nd day, she was in the doorway when she heard his breathing change. Alara heard it too. She didn't make a sound. She climbed up from the chair, slowly, carefully, with the deliberateness of someone who had thought about this moment while he was asleep and had decided how she would handle it, and settled beside him on the bed and put her head on his shoulder and closed her eyes. As if to say, "You came back. I am still here. This is where we are." The Scholar General turned away from the doorway. Later, when Alara had been persuaded by the palace cook to come eat something real, the Scholar General brought the files on Idrin to his room and walked him through the structure of it, the compound in his food, the cultivated triggers, the systematic dismantling of his confidence in his own control, done with surgical patience over years. She walked him through it the way she would walk anyone through intelligence, clearly, completely, without softening. At some point, they were both bent over the same document, the same page, the margins covered in her annotations, and she realized that at some point her hand had settled on the desk 3 inches from his, and she had not moved it. She moved it. He let her. "Thank you," he said, "for running the council. For the files. For staying." "I had reasons," she said. "I know," he said. "I'd like to think there was one more." She looked at him. His face was tired and honest and entirely without armor, the way it had been in the firelight 3 nights ago, the way she suspected it almost never was. She didn't answer. But she didn't leave either. The physician's findings were confirmed by 2 independent alchemists before she took them forward. A compound, introduced into his food in quantities too small for a standard examination to detect, accumulated in the body over time and produced a specific neurological effect. It didn't cause the shifts. It mimicked the internal sensation of losing control, the pressure behind the cognition, the same spiral, the feeling of the wolf overtaking the man, in a way that, in a wolf who already believed himself fundamentally dangerous, became self-fulfilling. The belief became the mechanism. The shame became the trigger. Without the compound, the physicians found, the shifts did not occur spontaneously. Had not occurred, going back further in the records than she'd expected. She read the full report twice before she picked it up and went to Idrin's holding cell. He was seated. He was impeccable, clothes unrumpled, posture correct, the expression of a man at a business meeting rather than a man in a cell awaiting adjudication. She stood in the doorway and did not move inside. Distance was a tool like any other. She did not ask him to explain. She told him what she knew. All of it. The compound, the duration, the triggers, the political architecture of what he'd built on top of it. She watched his face as she spoke. He did not try to deny any of it. The realm needs a weapon, he said. I made sure it had one. You made sure he couldn't trust himself, she said. Her voice was level. It had been level through 3 years of war, and it was level now, which cost her more than any of those years had. You built a mechanism to guarantee that the most powerful man in the realm believed, at his core, that he was a danger to everyone around him. You made him complicit in his own isolation. Idrin looked at her with something almost like respect. You would have made a good general for the right side. I was, she said, and left. She went directly to Kale. She sat across from him and read him the report. All of it. She used the words in it, the clinical language, the specific findings, the timeline. She did not soften a sentence or choose a gentler synonym because he had earned the truth and she would not manage him. She would not decide for him how much of his own story he could handle. The silence after was very long. The shifts were never mine, he said. No. Another silence. Then, will you stay while I... Yes, she said. Before he finished. She stayed. She didn't speak. He didn't speak. They sat in a silence that was not empty, that was, in fact, extraordinarily full, while he processed 3 years of shame that had never belonged to him. And she sat with the particular weight of knowing she had designed the operation that put the healer in the gorge, and neither of them found words for any of it, and neither of them needed to. Ilara appeared an hour later with 3 cups of tea that were mostly hot milk and sat between them, entirely satisfied, as if she had planned all of this, and it had come together precisely on schedule. Perhaps, the Scholar General thought she had. Spring came to the Iron Palace like it came everywhere, gradually and then all at once. The courtyard was full of light. Not the flat gray winter light that had been there since Ilara arrived, but actual spring light, warm and specific, casting real shadows. The snow had been gone for 3 weeks. The stone was dry. Somewhere in the southern garden, something was flowering. Princess Ilara, the silver pin already crooked, the new boots already muddy, the title held with the particular confidence of someone who had decided to treat it as a tool rather than an identity, was teaching the stable boy her filing system. She had adapted it for horse records, which presented unique organizational challenges she was explaining at some length. He looked both confused and entirely charmed. Kale stood at the top of the steps with his hands in his pockets. He was watching her the way he had been watching her since the moment she held a letter up to him in the middle of a road and asked him, without fear, without deference, without any awareness that this was an unusual thing to ask if he could read. He watched her with the expression of a man who had dismantled every defense he possessed and discovered that without them, he could breathe better. The Scholar General came up the steps to stand beside him. Her travel papers were in her satchel. The eastern border was open. The land agreements had been formally ratified, the southern territories acknowledged, her people's rights documented and filed in 3 separate archives. She had done everything she came to do. The work was complete. The reason to stay had expired 2 weeks ago, and she was still here, and she had stopped pretending she didn't know why. The eastern passes are clear, she said. I should go before summer. Yes, he said. You should. Neither of them moved. Ilara appeared from the direction of the stables, slightly faster than her usual pace, with the expression of someone who has checked the variables and confirmed her hypothesis. She stopped between them and looked up. You're both doing the face, she said. What face? The Scholar General asked. The one where you want to say something and you're waiting for the other person to say it first. She crossed her arms. My mother said that's how good things get lost. A pause that contained several entire conversations. She's not wrong, Kale said. The Scholar General looked at him. She had studied his decisions for 3 years and understood his patterns better than anyone alive, and she had never predicted this, had not had a model for a man who could be cracked open by a 7-year-old and decide, instead of closing himself back up, to stay open. Had not had a model for what she would feel, standing beside him in spring light, with a child between them who had never been taught to be afraid of wanting things. "I have a hypothesis," she said carefully, "that this is worth more than the research." "How confident are you?" he asked. 93%, she said. "I'm leaving room for variables." He reached out slowly and took her hand. Elara made a sound of profound and immediate satisfaction. "Now," she announced to the courtyard at large, with the tone of someone concluding a successful project, "I have 2 parents. My mother said good people are hard to find." She looked at each of them in turn. She was right. "I found 2. Cale pulled both of them, Scholar General, Child, into something that was not quite a hug and entirely one. His arms were large enough for both of them without difficulty. He held them both and said nothing. There was nothing that needed to be said. The Scholar General laughed. It surprised her entirely, the way a sound surprises you when you've forgotten you were capable of it. She felt Elara's small hand pat her arm with the consoling competence of a child who has decided things are going to be all right and is helping everyone else arrive at the same conclusion. "You'll get used to it," Elara said. She didn't mind at all. They stood like that for a long time. Long enough that the stable boy finished his lesson and slipped back to the horses with the particular quiet of someone who has understood he has witnessed something he should not interrupt. Long enough that 2 of the palace guards at the lower gate exchanged a glance and then carefully looked at the middle distance, which was the professional courtesy of men who had served the king through 3 wars and understood when not to see. When they finally broke apart, it was Elara who moved first. She stepped back and looked at each of them with an evaluating expression, the way she looked at everything she was categorizing. Then she nodded once, confirming something internal, and said, "I need to show you both something." She said it with the authority she brought to all logistics. "Come." She led them down through the lower corridor and out through the southern gate to the garden that had been closed since winter. Someone had unlocked it. The Scholar General had a suspicion about who. The garden was not formally beautiful, it was old, a little wild at the edges, the kind of space that had been designed for use rather than display. Stone benches along the inner wall. A central fountain that was running again, the sound of it filling the quiet like something remembered. And at the far end, half hidden by a climbing vine still finding its spring leaves, a carved stone marker. Not a gravestone. A memorial marker, the kind the palace used for those who died in service and whose bodies could not be returned. Elara's name was not on it. Her mother's was. Marin Voss, healer. 3rd campaign. And below that, in smaller letters that had been added recently, the stones still lighter around the new cuts, the words, "She knew things." Elara had brought a small bundle of early flowers, the first ones from the southern garden wall, yellow and very small, and she set them at the base of the stone with the focused care of someone performing a ritual they have thought through carefully. She stood for a moment with her hand on the stone. Then she straightened and looked at Cale. "You had it put here," she said. Not a question. 3 weeks ago, he said. "I should have done it sooner." "No," Elara said. "Now is right." She would have said now is right. She was particular about timing. She considered the stone for another moment. Then, I think she would have liked it here. The fountain sounds like the creek outside the camp where we lived last winter. A pause. She liked the sound of water. The Scholar General stood slightly to the side, hands folded, watching. She had not known Marin Voss. She had known the gorge, the field hospital coordinates, the strategic calculus of the Red Mark operation. She had not known the woman who sang to injured soldiers and sorted letters and told her daughter the truth about the world without making it smaller. She was beginning to understand, in the slow way that understanding arrived when it bypassed the intellect entirely, what had been lost in that gorge, and what had, impossibly, been preserved. Elara turned to look at her. "She would have liked you," she said. She liked people who said things directly. She said it was a courtesy most people didn't understand they were withholding. The Scholar General looked at the stone, at the small flowers at its base, at Elara's hand, which was back in her pocket now, the grief filed and folded alongside everything else, not gone, just carried. "She raised someone extraordinary," she said. "I think she would have liked knowing that." Elara absorbed this with the particular stillness of a child receiving something she had been hoping for without naming it. She did not perform gratitude. She simply held it. They stayed in the garden for a while. There was no agenda. This was unusual enough that the Scholar General noticed it. She had spent 3 years in environments where every moment had a purpose, a product, a measurable outcome. Sitting on a stone bench in an old garden while a child catalogued which plants had come back from winter and which hadn't was not a productive use of time by any metric she'd previously applied. It was, she was discovering, something else entirely. Kale sat beside her on the bench. Not close enough to require acknowledgement, close enough to be a choice. He didn't speak. He had, she was learning, a rare capacity for silence that was actually restful rather than pressurized, the silence of a man who had learned to stop filling space with noise when he had nothing to add to it. She appreciated it more than she knew how to say, so she didn't try. She simply sat in it with him and watched Elara crouch beside a dormant rose bush, explaining to it, in a patient tone, that it was spring now and it could come back. "She talks to plants," Kale observed. "She talks to everything," the Scholar General said. "The horses, the palace cat, the fountain this morning briefly. I believe she is of the view that communication improves most situations." "She's not wrong," he said. The Scholar General glanced at him. He was looking at Elara with the expression she had first noticed in the Great Hall on the day of his return, the one she hadn't had a name for, the one she'd filed away for later. She had the name for it now. It was love. Not the complicated, armored, qualified kind he'd spent years convincing himself he didn't have access to. The plain kind. The kind that just existed without requiring justification or strategy. She suspected he didn't know yet that it was visible from the outside. She decided not to tell him. It would sort itself. The formal ceremony was held 3 days later in the palace courtyard at Elara's specific request. She had been presented with the option of a private arrangement, and she had considered it seriously. Elara considered everything seriously, and concluded that the whole point of a thing being true was that it could be said out loud in front of people who might have questions. The court assembled the way courts assembled for formal declarations, in order of rank, with appropriate ceremony, in clothes that communicated something. The Scholar General stood to Kale's left in deep blue, not gray for once, not the scholar's practical colors she'd worn as a kind of armor since the day she arrived. She had not decided to wear blue. She had opened her wardrobe that morning and the gray had seemed, for the first time, like a choice she no longer needed to make. Kale noticed. He didn't say anything. He looked at her for half a second longer than he needed to, and that was enough. Elara stood in front of them both. New dress, new boots that were clean for approximately the last time. The silver pin, the small crown mark of a ward of the palace, was already crooked. She had been correcting it approximately every 4 minutes since breakfast, and it had corrected itself right back. She had, at some point in the last hour, decided to stop fighting it. The court clerk read the formal document. Cale had written it himself, which was not how these things were typically done. The language was therefore direct rather than ceremonial, which caused the clerk a brief moment of visible uncertainty before he soldiered through. The document said, Alara Vos Omega, formerly of the Healer's Corps of the Third Campaign, having been entrusted to the care of the crown by her mother's testament and by her own extraordinary judgment in the matter of finding herself a family, is hereby recognized as ward and heir of the Iron Realm, with all rights, protections, and obligations thereto. There was a murmur through the assembled court. Not dissent. The political ground had shifted too substantially in the past 2 months for open dissent to find purchase. More the sound of a large collective entity processing a new fact and rearranging itself around it. Cale knelt. He went to one knee in front of her, the Alpha King of the Iron Realm, in front of his assembled court, kneeling in the spring courtyard in front of a 7-year-old with a crooked pin and muddy boots, and he looked at her directly and said, with his voice only slightly unsteady, I am not going to be the kind of father who is easy. I don't know how to be easy. I will probably do this wrong in ways neither of us can predict yet. A pause. But I am going to try. Every day. I am going to choose this every day. Alara looked at him for a long moment. She reached out and straightened his collar, which did not need straightening, with the precise manner of someone performing a gesture they have been waiting to perform for some time. Then she said, My mother told me that the measure of a person is not whether they make mistakes. It's whether they come back. She met his eyes steadily. You came back from the forest. You came back from the shifts. You came for me at the gate. She paused. You always come back. He pressed his forehead gently against hers. The court was completely still. The Scholar General, standing behind them both, found that she was gripping her own hands together, not out of anxiety, but because she needed something to do with the feeling that had nowhere else to go. When he stood, Alara turned and looked at the Scholar General with an expression that was entirely Alara, evaluating, warm, and several steps ahead of everyone else in the room. You're staying, she said. Still not a question. A category of things she had moved past asking. The Scholar General looked at the travel papers still in her satchel. She had been carrying them for 2 weeks. She took them out. She held them for one moment, the weight of them, the specific weight of a decision already made presenting itself as a formality, and then she folded them lengthwise and held them out to the court clerk, who received them with visible surprise. File those, she said. Under resolved. Alara made a sound of deep and total contentment, the kind that had no performance in it at all. She took the Scholar General's hand on one side and Cale's on the other, and held them, one in each of hers, and turned to face the court with a directness that was entirely her mother's and entirely her own. Later, after the court had dispersed and the afternoon had settled into the long gold quiet of a spring evening, the 3 of them ended up back in the garden. No particular plan. Alara had brought a book and was reading it on the bench near the fountain. Cale was leaning against the wall in the last of the sunlight with his eyes half closed, which was the closest he came to peace in any posture the Scholar General had observed. She was working a letter to her people in the South, detailing the ratified terms, the open roads, the specific provisions for the border communities. Work that mattered. Work she had earned the right to do from here. At some point the book closed and Alara looked up at the rose bush she had spoken to 3 days ago. New growth had appeared, a single bud, very small, very green at the end of the outermost cane. She did not point at it. She simply looked at it with a satisfaction so complete it required no comment. The Scholar General noticed her noticing. She set down her pen. "You told it to come back," she said. "Everything responds better to being spoken to," Alara said. Then, thoughtfully, "My mother said that." The fountain filled the silence. Kale had opened his eyes and was looking at the rose bush too now, and then at Alara, and then at the Scholar General, and his face held the expression of a man taking inventory of what he had and finding, with something close to wonder, that it was more than he had known how to ask for. The war had cost everything. The peace had been built from wreckage, from obligation and grief and strategic necessity, and a healer who had trusted the right person with the most important thing she had. None of it was clean. None of it had been simple. The story did not pretend that the gorge hadn't happened, or that the shifts had left no mark, or that 3 years of careful dismantling could be undone in a season. It didn't need to be clean. It only needed to be true. It was true. Alara picked up her book. She read 3 pages. She set it down again and looked at both adults, the Scholar General with her letter, Kale with his eyes on the garden, and she said, with the quiet certainty of someone issuing a final verdict on a completed investigation, "This is what home feels like." Neither adult argued with her. Neither adult had any grounds to. The light changed. The sun dropped below the palace wall and the garden moved from gold to the soft, specific blue of a spring evening, not dark yet, not quite anything. The kind of light that exists only for a few minutes and makes everything in it look slightly more permanent than it is. Alara had not moved from the bench. She had given up on the book and was watching the fountain with the comfortable attention of someone who had nowhere else to be and knew it. "Tell me something about her," she said. She was not looking at either of them. She was looking at the water. "Something I didn't know. Something small." Kale was quiet for a moment. Then, she folded things. The bandages, the field notes, everything. Even in a crisis. She said neat hands made calm hands. Alara's chin moved slightly. "Recognition. She taught me that." "I thought she made it up." "She may have," Kale said. She said a lot of things as though she'd invented them. She was convincing about it. "Yes," Alara said, with enormous fondness. She was. The Scholar General set her letter face down on the table. She had been holding her pen without writing for the last several minutes, which she had not noticed until now. She looked at Alara's profile in the blue evening light, the particular angle of her jaw that was her father's, apparently, and the patience in her eyes that was entirely her mother's. And she thought about the version of herself that had arrived at this palace 2 months ago. The woman who had mapped every exit. Who had slept with the travel papers under her pillow for the first 3 weeks. Who had decided, very early and very firmly, that she would not allow any of this to matter. That woman had lasted approximately 11 days. She was fairly certain she knew the exact moment. It was the courtyard, a small girl standing in front of a stable boy with her arms slightly out and her chin up, the most undefended and the most immovable thing in the frame. She had watched and felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was held tight, and that was that. The rest had been inevitable, even when she was still pretending it wasn't. "Something small from you, too," Alara said. She had turned her head. She was looking at the Scholar General now with the particular directness of someone who has decided to ask for something and is not going to perform uncertainty about it. "About your mother. Or your home. Something you liked before." The Scholar General considered this. Not the way she had once considered everything, looking for the angle, the implication, the thing she might be walking into. Just considered it, the way a person considers a genuine question when they trust the person asking. "We had a wall at the back of the house," she said. "Old stone. It held the heat from the afternoon sun until well after dark. In summer, my mother used to sit with her back against it after dinner and say it was better than any fire." A pause. "I haven't thought about that in years." Elara looked at the palace wall behind Kale. She looked at Kale. She looked back at the Scholar General. "That wall gets sun all afternoon," she said. Helpfully, as a point of information. Kale made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family. He pushed off from the wall and came to sit on the bench beside Elara, which left the bench exactly full, the Scholar General on one end, Elara in the middle, Kale on the other, their shoulders close in the cooling evening. Elara settled between them with the contentment of a person who has arranged furniture and found it functions exactly as intended. They sat like that as the garden went dark around them, the fountain a constant quiet in the blue, the first stars appearing over the eastern wall. Elara fell asleep between them somewhere in the middle of it, gradually, then completely, the way children sleep, her head tipping until it found the Scholar General's shoulder and staying there. Neither adult moved. Neither adult spoke for a long time. Then Kale said, quietly, "I'm going to build something here. Not just govern it. Something worth handing to her." He was looking at Elara's sleeping face. "I don't entirely know how yet." "You'll have help," the Scholar General said. It was the most direct thing she had said to him that was not strategic, and she said it without qualifying it or walking it back. She felt him look at her across Elara's sleeping head. She did not look away. The rose bush was a dark shape against the garden wall. Somewhere in it, invisible in the night, the single bud held its ground against the cold. It had been told to come back, and so it had, and so it would open, not because anyone commanded it, but because something in it had decided that was what it was going to do. In the morning it would be there. In a week it would be red, or pink, or something the three of them would argue briefly about when Elara declared its color with complete confidence and both adults turned out to be wrong. But that was later. Tonight, the garden was quiet and the fountain ran and a child slept between two people who had arrived here by entirely different roads and found, without planning to, that they had been walking toward the same place. A family made from wreckage and obligation and the particular stubbornness of a 7-year-old who had been taught that good people existed and had refused to stop looking until she found them. It was not a simple thing. It was not a clean thing. It was, in every way that mattered, exactly enough.
If you enjoy watching this story, please like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.